and the Israeli Palestinian Forum. My name is Dr. James Boys. I'm a Senior Visiting Research Fellow here with the Middle East and the Mediterranean Studies Department. We're very lucky tonight to have with us Dr. Avi Raz, who is a member of the faculty at the Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford, and a research associate at Oxford Centre for International Studies, and a research fellow at Wolfson College, Oxford. He's going to be giving a talk tonight called Perish the Thought, Israel and the Search for Peace in the Aftermath of the June 1967 War. The forum for this evening, we're going to be here for about an hour and 20 minutes, I guess, looking at the time now. We're going to try and finish about 7:30 so that our guests can get home and you can get something to eat. I know it's we're sort of meeting over dinner time, so we want to make sure that you get something to eat. Before you leave tonight, however, there is a wonderful opportunity for you to get a copy, a signed copy, I would point out, of Dr. Raz's new book called The Bride and the Dowry, usually retailing for the price of £25. You can get it tonight, signed and at a discounted rate of £20. So if you're interested in a copy, they're available, and please see us immediately afterwards. Before we move on, just to give a quick plug to an event taking place next Thursday. Eric Kaufman from Birkbeck College will be giving a speech and a talk on American population, and especially to do with the rising Hispanic population in the United States. If you're interested in that, please see Harry from War Studies. Tonight, we've got an interesting talk ahead of us, so without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over. If you have any questions, we've got plenty of time for Q&A afterwards, so let me turn the floor over. And ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Avi Raz.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And first, because you mentioned the book, I should recommend the book. I read it several times, and it's an excellent book. And one more thing. There are two things that I hate about speakers. One, when a speaker has an accent. And secondly, when a speaker reads his presentation paper. And I'm going to offer you both, I'm afraid. There is nothing I can do about my accent, and it would be better off if I read it instead of speaking it. My talk is based on my new book, The Bride and the Dowry, which deals with the formative first 2 years of the Israeli 45 years long occupation that still continues today. My main focus is Israel's foreign policy. What was decided and carried out during this short period crucially shaped things to come. Some of the most serious obstacles to an Arab-Israeli peace were created then, in 1967, notably the Israeli annexation of Arab Jerusalem and the Jewish settlement project. Others, such as the denial of the Palestinian refugees the right of return, were exacerbated after the June 67 war. Most significantly, Israel adopted a dishonest foreign policy in order to stay put in the occupied territories. All this happened when the Israeli government was headed by a prime minister who was considered moderate, weak, and indecisive. Under successive prime ministers and cabinets, the situation had got much worse, but Israel has enjoyed an unfailing American support throughout those years. The American support also started after the 67 war. During this period, the period I'm looking at, a myth was established which airbrushes out much of what really happened. In short, the current statement is heavily rooted in the period that I shall discuss here in detail. Indeed, this will be the perfect example of the expression, the devil is in the detail. The Six-Day War was a war that nobody wanted. A series of blunders led to the eruption in mid-May 67 of a regional crisis, which culminated on 5th of June in an Israeli onslaught on Egypt. During the 3-week waiting period that preceded the war, the Arab world had been swept by a wave of belligerency toward the Jewish state. Israel was viewed by Western public opinion as the victim, a tiny state surrounded by formidable Arab enemies determined to destroy her. Because of the blood-curdling Arab threats of annihilation, many in the West, but not governments, believed that Israel, being on the verge of destruction, had every right to launch a preemptive war. Shortly after Israel launched its attack on Egypt, Jordan joined the fray, by shelling the Israeli part of Jerusalem and other targets in central Israel. Syria, who actually triggered the crisis, attempted to avoid fighting. But on the 5th day of the war, after routing the Egyptian and Jordanian armies, Israel nevertheless turned on Syria as well. By the evening of 10th of June, when the guns of the Six-Day War fell silent, Israel controlled territories more than 3 times its own size. The West Bank, including Arab Jerusalem, was taken from Jordan, the Golan Heights were seized from Syria, Egypt lost the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, and Saudi Arabia forfeited the little island of Tiran. Israel was drunk with victory. We are now an empire, boasted Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defense minister, at the end of the war. This megalomaniac moment, when Israel saw itself as omnipotent world power, is the starting point of my book. Now it's the time to explain the title of the book, The Bride and the Dowry. The title draws on a metaphor coined by Levi Eshkol, Israel's prime minister, immediately after the stunning military victory. In Eshkol's metaphor, Israel's territorial conquests were a dowry, and the Arab population a bride. The trouble is that the dowry is followed by a bride whom we don't want, the prime minister repeatedly lamented. Eshkol's metaphor adequately encapsulated the Israeli post-war ambition. My book shows that the so-called moderate Eshkol and his national unity government effectively translated the metaphor into a policy whose aim was to appropriate the dowry and divorce the bride. In other words, the government's controlling consideration was the desire to keep as many of the occupied lands as possible with as few Arab inhabitants as possible. The Arab lands were coveted for strategic, historical, religious, and even messianic reasons. The Arab people were undesirable because they presented, I need 2 figures for that, demographic dangers. The annexation of Arab Jerusalem was the first concrete demonstration of growing Israeli wish to have the dowry without the bride. On the 11th of June, less than 24 hours after the final ceasefire had taken effect, the cabinet agreed to annex the Arab part of Jerusalem. The decision was carried out 2 weeks later by swift passage in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, of 3 laws which deliberately did not mention Jerusalem nor use the term annexation. But this was annexation in all but name. The annexed area, which surrounds Jerusalem to the north, the east, and the south, and this is why the term East Jerusalem is geographically at least incorrect. Well, this area was 12 times bigger than the municipal territory of Jordanian Jerusalem. It encompassed, wholly or partially, the lands of 28 Palestinian villages, and also covered areas which had been included within the municipal limits of El Bira, Beit Jalla, and Bethlehem. These are towns around Jerusalem. The boundaries had been demarcated so as to include the minimum possible number of Arab inhabitants, and the method by which the annexation was legislated freed Israel from the need to grant the 70,000 Arab residents of the annexed area Israeli citizenship. From the very beginning of the occupation, the Eshkol government applied a foreign policy of deception. In fact, the term policy is misleading. No explicit decision regarding such a policy was taken. After all, no Israeli government has ever been accused of having a systematic decision-making process, nor of ever adopting a long-range policy. There were instead a series of cabinet resolutions and ad hoc governmental decisions and actions which added up to a consistent policy of deception, the aim of which was to mislead the international community, and specifically the United States, into thinking that Israel was making serious efforts to reach a peaceful settlement with its Arab neighbors. Indeed, the annexation of Arab Jerusalem also involved a foreign policy of deception. Israeli diplomats were instructed by the foreign ministry to conceal the true meaning of the legislation, but to no avail. Within days, the United Nations General Assembly called on Israel to rescind the annexation. Foreign Minister Avi Raz responded in a letter to the UN Secretary General saying that the annexation was merely, quote, the integration of Jerusalem in the administrative and municipal spheres. A few days later, when Arthur Goldberg, the American ambassador to the UN and a committed Zionist, asked Ibn whether he could specifically say that the so-called administrative measures taken in Jerusalem were interim, the foreign minister retorted that if he did that, the government in Tel Aviv would become interim. Let's now look more closely at the right. Before the war, close to 1.3 million Palestinians lived in the West Bank, Arab Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. As a result of the hostilities, more than 250,000 of them became refugees. Tens of thousands of these new refugees fled their homes, as people in war zones always do, and because of fears fed by the memories of what had happened in 1948. Yet Israeli troops also played a role in the outflow. As early as 7th of June, the third day of the Six-Day War, Defense Minister Dayan told Yitzhak Rabin, the chief of the General Staff, that the aim was to empty the West Bank of its inhabitants. The West Bank, as well as the Gaza Strip, are part of biblical Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel, a fact that made these regions most desirable to the Israelis. The Israeli forces applied various, and again my figures are needed here, subtle methods intended to make the Palestinians leave. These methods included announcements through loudspeakers mounted on army cars and radio broadcasts advising the Palestinians that they should take the road to the Jordan River or face the consequences. Nightly shooting in the air or even shooting above people's heads, and a free one-way bus service from Arab Jerusalem and other West Bank cities to the river. In some places, the Israeli troops forced the Palestinian inhabitants onto waiting buses and trucks. Some 20 Palestinian villages and towns in the West Bank were destroyed, completely or partially, by the Israeli military after the fighting had ended. The 20,000 inhabitants were rendered homeless, and consequently, many of them crossed the river. The long columns of refugees from the destroyed villages increased fear and served as an additional inducement to flee. The total number of the West Bank and Arab Jerusalem refugees was estimated in early July '67 at 200,000 out of the total population of 800,000, a quarter. The number of the Gaza Strip refugees was estimated at 35,000 out of almost 400,000, about 10%. Although my book deals only with the Palestinian inhabited occupied territories, the Golan Heights should also be mentioned in this context. Of the 100,000 Syrians who had lived on the Golan, there remained merely 6,000 Druze in half a dozen villages. All the rest, mostly Sunnis, who lived in 200 villages and agriculture farms, mazra'at in Arabic, fled or were driven out by the Israelis. Later, the army razed their villages to the ground, so there would be no homes to return to. And this is really the most significant fact about this, saying quite a bit about the Israeli intentions. These acts, war crimes actually, were initiated by the military. But the political leadership welcomed the Palestinian exodus. For example, in a gathering of the Army General Command Staff a few weeks after the war, Defense Minister Dayan referred to the destruction spree in the West Bank and said that it had been motivated by Zionist intentions. This was his phrase, which he fully shared. On 25th of June, when the number of the new refugees from the West Bank was thought to be only 100,000, Dayan expressed his sense of ratification. Quote, "I hope they'll all go. If we could achieve the departure of 300,000 without pressure, it would be a great blessing." Unquote. All the while, the world was watching with growing apprehension. The Palestinian refugee problem, which had been created in the 1948 war, was now about to be doubled. As early as the 14th of June, the UN Security Council unanimously passed a resolution calling upon Israel to facilitate the return of the Six-Day War refugees. But when the West Bank refugees wished to return to their homes, Israel refused to allow them back. Those who attempted to infiltrate across the Jordan were shot dead by Israeli troops who regularly ambushed them on the ceasefire line. In early July, following an international outcry and growing American pressure, the Israeli government was forced to announce a repatriation program, dubbed Mivtza Palit, Hebrew for Operation Refugee, and presented as a benevolent Israeli gesture. The program was not intended to allow a mass return, but only to look like one. The return of the new refugees was frustrated by numerous bureaucratic obstacles and by the exclusion of Jerusalem inhabitants, 1948 refugees, and men over 16 and under 60. Jerusalem inhabitants because Jerusalem must be Jewish. 48 refugees because Israel refused to take any responsibility for the 48 refugee problem. And men over 16 and under 60, of course, it's obvious why. But you have to bear in mind that once the breadwinner is not allowed back, then the whole family doesn't come back. Indeed, out of 170,000 applicants, only 14,000 eventually returned, 8.2%. Secretary of State Dean Rusk's angry insistence on the repatriation of the remainder of the new refugees was met with evasive Israeli excuses and empty promises. In the following months and years, Israel implemented a number of top-secret schemes designed to encourage the Palestinians to emigrate to Jordan, other Arab countries, or across the sea, especially to South America. These efforts predominantly targeted the 48 refugees living in the Gaza Strip, some 200,000 people. Prime Minister Eshkol personally supervised the most ambitious immigration operation, which relied on meager financial incentives. Before becoming Prime Minister, Eshkol was Finance Minister, so he was a bit stingy when it came to money. Let's now move to the dowry. Barring the Palestinians from returning to their homes in the occupied territories signaled an Israeli intention not only to dispose of the bride, but also to retain the territorial dowry. At a party rally in August '67, Dayan bluntly asserted that Israel must not return to the pre-war borders because it needed living space to deter adventurous Arab leaders. This was his expression. 22 years after the Holocaust, Dayan was speaking of the need of living space, a notion shockingly reminiscent of Adolf Hitler's infamous Lebensraum. The intention to keep the dowry was clearly demonstrated by building Jewish settlements in the occupied territories. The settlement project started on the Golan Heights as early as July '67, shortly after a cabinet resolution passed on 19 June, which seemingly proposed withdrawal from the occupied Syrian and Egyptian lands in return for contractual peace with these countries. This resolution, which became known as the German peace offer, was never offered to the Arabs. It was merely a diplomatic maneuver to gain American political support against the Soviet effort at the UN to bring about an immediate and unconditional Israeli withdrawal. The civilian settlement in the Golan was soon followed by civilian settlement in the West Bank. Having been advised by legal experts, plural, that civilian settlement in occupied territories contravened the Fourth Geneva Convention, the cabinet decided that, quote, as a cover for Israel's diplomatic campaign, the new settlements should be presented as military strongpoints, unquote. As contemporary American and British diplomatic dispatches prove, nobody believed it. In fact, the civilian settlers in the Golan and in the West Bank were not ready to take part in their government's charade. Those settlers were there because of ideological reasons, so they didn't want to play the government's game. Deception characterized the Israeli approach from the very start. The surprise offensive Israel launched against Egypt on 5th of June '67 was accompanied by a false announcement. Quote, the Egyptian forces opened air and land attacks this morning, the official statement of the army spokesman read, and the Israeli forces have gone out to stop the advancing Egyptians. This was untrue. No Egyptian tanks had moved toward the Negev at dawn, as the announcement stated, nor had Egyptian aircraft approached Israel's territory. It was Israel who started the war. And the main reason for the lie was the Israeli attempt to conceal this fact. 10 days before, President Charles de Gaulle of France had bluntly warned Foreign Minister Ibn, do not be the first to shoot. Being then Israel's major arms supplier, particularly the frontline Mirage fighters, France's stark warning carried much weight. Washington also demanded that Israel exert restraint. Contrary to claims in the existing literature, President Lyndon Johnson never replaced the red light he had given Israel against attacking Egypt with a green or amber one. The false announcement, by the way, the false announcement has somehow connected, has a family connection here, because it was read by my cousin, who was a newsreader on Israeli radio, but I don't take responsibility for that. So the false announcement accusing Egypt of starting the war was followed by public pledges from Prime Minister Eshkol, Defense Minister Dayan, and Foreign Minister Ibn, assuring the world that Israel had no aims of territorial conquest. Quote, we seek nothing but peaceful life within our territory, Eshkol wrote to US President Johnson and USSR Premier Alexei Kosygin on the morning of 5th of June. When the fighting ended, Defense Minister Dayan famously stated, we are awaiting the Arabs' phone call. In the following months and years, he and his colleagues incessantly claimed that there was no one to talk to on the other side. Again, this was untrue. The phone calls Dayan had expected came without delay. First, there was a local call from the occupied West Bank, and soon afterward, Jordan. While Syria rejected any kind of accommodation with Israel, and Egypt, under President Gamal Abdel Nasser, was still not ready seriously to negotiate an accord with the Jewish state, the two claimants to the West Bank and Arab Jerusalem, the West Bank Palestinian leadership and King Hussein of Jordan, the biggest losers in the June War, were ready and eager to resolve the conflict with Israel directly. Both communicated their peaceful desires from the start of the occupation. They presented Israel with two competing options for a settlement. The West Bankers embodied what became known in Israel as the Palestinian option, while the Hashemite kingdom was considered the Jordanian option. With the whole of mandatory Palestine and more than half of the Palestinian people under its control, Israel was thus provided with a historical opportunity to defuse the Palestinian problem, which lies at the heart of the decades-long Arab-Zionist conflict. However, it chose neither option. Instead, Israel used the two options in order to preserve the territorial status quo of 10th of June, the last day of the war, first and foremost in the Palestinian-inhabited West Bank and Gaza Strip. I shall begin with the Palestinian option. Immediately after the fighting, the West Bank political elite expressed the desire to reach a separate peace settlement with Israel based on a two-state solution, an idea which was then regarded by most Arabs as anathema. This elite was mostly comprised of traditional leaders and urban notables, Ayan in Arabic, and many of them were part of the Jordanian establishment. In the summer of '67, they could deliver because the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was then an insignificant body, largely controlled by Egypt, and the Palestinian guerrilla organizations, notably Al-Fatah, were still limited in number and appeal. Following the annexation of Arab Jerusalem, the West Bank notables changed tack and opted for a Jordanian Israeli settlement. Only a small group still advocated the creation of a Palestinian entity in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, with Arab Jerusalem as its capital. Nonetheless, they all wished to resolve the conflict with Israel peacefully. Israel not only ignored the peaceful ideas and overtures of the West Bankers, but also banned political organization and denied Palestinian requests to convene and discuss political solutions. Even non-political associations, including social clubs such as Rotary or Lions, were not permitted together. The Israelis, desiring a trouble-free occupation, were not looking for independent-minded leaders, but for lackeys. In July '67, Israel's Internal Security Service, Shabak is the Hebrew acronym for this agency, launched a secret operation aiming to turn West Bank leaders into prisoners. In the same month, Israel began to exile Palestinian leaders who did not toe the official line. And in September, it started to deport them to Jordan. Moving to the Jordanian option, King Hussein was a different matter because he was America's ally. In addition to a sense of duty toward the king, post-war American diplomatic efforts, as well as those of the Soviets, were set in the context of the Cold War. In reaction to the defeat of Egypt and Syria, both Soviet clients, the USSR deepened its penetration into the Middle East. This development unsettled Washington, which was preoccupied with the worsening situation in the Vietnam War. Afraid of losing Jordan, the Americans pressured Israel to negotiate a settlement with pro-Western Hussein. Indeed, the Americans accepted that the Israeli demand that the armistice agreements of 1949, following the 48 war, should be replaced by peace treaties, but they insisted that these peace treaties should be based on the 49 armistice lines with small reciprocal adjustments. In other words, the White House and the State Department saw Israel as staying within the pre-Six-Day War borders, with the West Bank to be returned to Jordan, America's other ally in the region. And there was nothing new in the Obama's statement in this regard last year, which really angered the Israelis. In other words, this was the American position from the day one of the occupation. The Israelis could not afford to alienate the United States. They counted on American support against the UN draft resolution demanding an immediate and unconditional Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, which the Soviets tabled 3 days after the hostilities. Hussein was eager to resolve the conflict with Israel in return for his lost territories. Israel, on the other hand, had no intention to negotiate in good faith with Hussein. Between September 63 and November 66, Jordan and Israel had been the best of enemies. In 63, Hussein had initiated a secret face-to-face dialogue with Israel. In these pre-war meetings, the king and Israel reached an understanding on a number of issues and effectively established a peaceful coexistence. But the Israeli raid on the West Bank village of Samoa in November 66, in other words, before the war, half a year before the war, in response to a Syrian-sponsored Al-Fatah attack, shattered Hussein's trust in Israel. The king felt betrayed by the Israelis. Even so, the disastrous outcome of the June war drove Hussein to resume the dialogue. On 2nd of July, a bare 3 weeks after losing the old city of Jerusalem in the West Bank, the king secretly met Yaakov Herzog, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol's most trusted advisor. This was the 5th meeting of the two men. Like all but one of their previous meetings, it took place not too far from here, in the home of Hussein's Jewish physician in London. Hussein told Herzog that he was trying to set up an Arab summit conference to decide what course the Arabs should take. Should he fail to achieve a united Arab line for peace, he would feel free to act unilaterally in relation to Israel. Herzog said that he could not discuss details of a peace settlement until the king said officially that he was ready to enter into peace negotiations with Israel. They parted after agreeing to resume contacts following the summit. There was a more compelling explanation for Herzog's silence about Israel's peace terms. They did not exist. In fact, 2 weeks before the Herzog-Hussein meeting, the divided Israeli cabinet had decided, quote, to defer the discussion of the position regarding Jordan, unquote. Hussein did not wait for an Arab summit. 10 days after the London encounter, and with President Nasser's approval, the king conveyed to Israel his readiness to negotiate a settlement. Through the Americans and the British, Hussein asked Israel of its peace terms. The eventual Israeli response welcomed the idea of negotiations, but lacked anything of substance. This became a repeating pattern which characterized the Israeli-Jordanian direct contacts in the following year. Time and again, Hussein inquired about Israeli ideas. I hate it there. This was also untrue. Israel told the king nothing because it had nothing to say, since the government had decided not to decide. Small wonder then that Prime Minister Levi Eshkol frequently admitted to his inner circle, quote, "I fear the day when we have to sit face to face and conduct negotiations with Hussein," unquote. In the fall of '67, Washington increased its pressure on Israel to negotiate a settlement with Hussein. In early November, President Johnson received the king at the White House and promised him that he would get the West Bank back within 6 months. Wishing to put off the evil hour, the Israelis turned to the hitherto ignored Palestinian option. The idea was to present the Palestinians as an alternative to Hussein by holding extensive talks with them. Hussein is scared to death of this, Defense Minister Dayan assured his cabinet colleagues. Indeed, he was. This stratagem was intended to force the king to the bargaining table with very modest expectations. The talks with the West Bank leaders led nowhere, and lasted 3 months and led nowhere, but they dispersed a dark cloud which might have hung over Eshkol's talks with President Johnson in January '68. One of Israel's main goals in the Eshkol-Johnson summit was to persuade the president to allow the sale of 50 state-of-the-art Phantom fighter bombers. Israel desperately needed those planes after losing 20% of its air force in the war, and France refused to deliver the 50 Mirages already paid for. And by the way, the French embargo, of course, proved that the lie about the outbreak of the war did not work. In other words, my family failed. Another essential goal, and not only my family failed, but the joke didn't work. Another essential goal was to convince the Americans that Israel was striving to achieve peace. On 22nd of November '67, the Security Council adopted the ambiguous Resolution 242, which became the cornerstone of all the attempts to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict to the present day. In its preamble, the resolution emphasized the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territories by war, but fell short of demanding a total Israeli withdrawal. Its English version called for a withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, not the territories, or all the territories. The resolution also sanctioned a UN peace mission, and Gunnar Yarin, Sweden ambassador to Moscow, was entrusted with this task. It took Israel 6 months to express a half-hearted acceptance of Resolution 242. Unwilling to relinquish its war acquisitions, the main aim of Israel's foreign policy in '68 was to keep the Yarin mission alive so as to avoid renewed discussion at the Security Council, leading to an unambiguous and stronger resolution than 242. Yarin embarked on his Sisyphean mission in December '67. While the Arabs insisted on an Israeli withdrawal as a first step, Israel demanded an unconditional direct negotiations. None of the parties was willing to relent. Foreign Minister Eben feared that the failure of the Yarin mission would have grave consequences for Israel at the Security Council, and he proudly boasted behind the closed doors of the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Security Committee about the scheme he had devised to preempt such an eventuality. Israel was feeding Yarin with numerous procedural proposals, some of which were quite preposterous, which the Arabs simply dismissed. The accumulating proposals were kept in a special dossier in order to demonstrate to the Security Council, when the time comes, Israel's positive approach compared with the Arab negative attitude. The dossier, even added, should be made as thick as possible because it was also important in the short run to maintain the support of the United States and other friendly governments. All the while, the secret channel of contacts between King Hussein and Eshkol's confidant Yaakov Herzog remained open. In early May '68, Abba Ibn himself met the king. The foreign minister now heard firsthand what he had already known, that Hussein was eager to negotiate a peaceful settlement with Israel. In view of this, and the growing American resentment at Israel's evasive behavior, it seemed that the crunch had finally arrived. In a further attempt to play for time, the Israeli government redoubled its double game. As regards Hussein, Ibn summarized the Israeli line in a closed meeting in June, and I quote, "The government," he said, "was not engaged in a peace process, but in a tactical political struggle designed to maintain the status quo and to avoid foreign political intervention. Only contacts with Hussein could save Israel from this. Israel, therefore, should maintain a futile discussion with Jordan, which should last weeks and months," unquote. In another internal discussion, Ibn said that the purpose was to keep the contacts with Hussein going, so that there should be a follow-up meeting with Hussein, and then another one, and yet a third, and so on. Ibn, a self-proclaimed moderate, used to describe his diplomatic approach as tahsisanut, a Hebrew term frequently used by him, apparently to indicate tactics, though in reality it meant prevarication or deviousness. By the way, are there any Israelis in the audience? No? I'm the only one? The Dosa diplomacy was, of course, an essential part of Ibn's tahsisanut. Ibn's tahsisanut embodied the Israeli foreign policy of deception, which was intended to buy Israel time while creating fait accompli. But in the second half of '68, as Washington put further pressure on Israel to negotiate with Jordan, Israel was compelled to talk substance with Hussein for the first time. The meeting took place in London in late September. Deputy Prime Minister Yigal Allon accompanied Ibn, and the two men presented the Allon plan, which offered Hussein 2/3 of the West Bank in the shape of an enclave with a connecting corridor to the East Bank. Regarding Jerusalem, Israel was willing to bestow upon Hussein the status of guardian of the Muslim holy places, but nothing more. The Allon plan was presented in full knowledge that it was totally unacceptable to Hussein. Moreover, the Allon plan was never approved by the cabinet, the Israeli cabinet. But the Allon plan was not a genuine peace plan. In the words of none other than its author, Yigal Allon, quote, "No Arab would ever accept the plan, and nothing will come out of it. But we must appear before the world with a positive plan," unquote. And if this was not enough, the Israelis insisted on the Jewish historical association with biblical Eretz Israel, land of Israel. They told Hussein that in practical terms, the historical association of the Jews with the land of Israel meant the Jews should enjoy the right to settle anywhere in the West Bank, regardless of sovereignty, and to come and go as they pleased. Concurrently, Israel played the Palestinian card by attempting in the summer of '68 to establish an Arab civil administration run by local collaborators and devoid of power. As Defense Minister Dayan explained in cabinet, the idea was to replace the current situation, which had been imposed on the West Bankers, with a new situation, which would be basically the same, but would enjoy the endorsement of the inhabitants in a bilateral agreement. This endeavor was, of course, used by Israeli diplomacy to claim that Israel was still weighing the Palestinian option as well as the Jordanian one. Eventually, the Arab civil administration scheme ended in fiasco, but the Americans never took it seriously anyway. In one of their meetings, Secretary of State Rusk reminded Ibn of Israel's 5th of June pledges of having no aims of conquest. According to Rusk's autobiography, Ibn, quote, simply shrugged his shoulders and said, "We've changed our minds," unquote. Indeed, as the days rolled on, Israel's territorial appetite grew stronger, and with it, its intransigence. On 31st of October '68, the cabinet decided that peace with Egypt required changes to the international border, reiterated the previous resolution, which stated that the Gaza Strip was part of the state of Israel, and determined that Israel would maintain its control over Sharm el-Sheikh with territorial continuity to the state of Israel. The distance between Sharm el-Sheikh at the extreme south of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and Eilat, the city of Eilat, at the extreme south of Israel, is 300 kilometers, 200 miles. The new resolution was soon communicated to Washington. The Americans were furious. Two senior White House officials, Walt Rostow, who was the National Security Advisor, and Harold Saunders, bluntly said in a meeting with Israel's Ambassador Rabin, and I quote, "We've told you the US position ad nauseum. You have to give the West Bank back. You have to give Hussein a role in Jerusalem. A Polish corridor to Sharm el-Sheikh doesn't make sense. When Alon was here, we told him what we thought of his plan. If the Israelis aren't tired of hearing this, we'll be glad to say it again. But we think they have known all along what our position is if they have been listening," unquote. Incidentally, this passage is taken from a dispatch written by Saunders, and it ends with the words, "We parted as friends." And these words actually indicate that the atmosphere was anything but friendly during this meeting. The Americans were aware of Israel's duplicity, so was King Hussein. In December '68, in a meeting with Governor William Scranton, President-elect Richard Nixon's special emissary to the Middle East, Hussein handed him a written statement in which he said, and again I quote, For whatever reason, Israel is not truly serious in negotiating a settlement with Jordan. It is quite clear to me that Israel has adopted a transparent and cynical policy of using the excuse of alleged negotiations in an attempt to prevent or delay any possible pressure from outside, and thus, because of internal differences, to avoid having to make any decisions of the terms of a final settlement, unquote. In his pioneering analysis of lying in international relations, entitled Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics, John Mearsheimer argues that interstate lying is not prone to backfire, and even if it does, it is unlikely that the target state would retaliate. But Mearsheimer's discussion does not provide a fitting answer to the Israeli case. Israel enjoyed impunity in Washington despite its persistent foreign policy of deception, which damaged American interests, though it was dependent on diplomatic support and supply of arms from the United States. So why did Washington acquiesce? In my view, the main reason was the personal attitude of President Johnson toward the Jewish state. Shortly after taking office, following the assassination of President John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson told a visiting Israeli diplomat, quote, "You have lost a very great friend, but you have found a better one," unquote. Johnson had a biblically based religious background that reinforced his sympathy towards Israel. He tended to see the Israelis fighting the Arabs as a modern-day version of the Texans struggling with the Mexicans in the mid-19th century. Johnson was a Texan himself. The United States, being Israel's provider of political support and arms, possessed the necessary levers to exert influence on Israel, but it did not use them. Israel then achieved its primary aims, playing for time, fending off external pressure, and maintaining the status quo. But it also squandered, or even scorned, a real opportunity for a peaceful settlement. This legacy is still with us today. Thank you.
Excellent, wonderful. Well, certainly very, very interesting, and I hope you found that engaging and informative. We've got about 40 minutes or so for questions and answers, and I'm quite sure that what you've heard is hopefully provoked some interesting responses and questions. I'm going to ask you to come forward with them in a moment, but I'm going to take Chair's prerogative, if you don't mind, and ask the first question to get the ball rolling. I was interested to hear what you were saying there in closing, and quoting Mearsheimer in particular. You talked about the impunity with which the Israelis can act with regards to the United States. I just wondered if you could talk briefly. We often hear, and obviously Mearsheimer and Walt got an awful lot of attention for this several years ago when they talked about the Jewish-Israeli lobby with regard to that relationship. I wonder if you can address the issue as to what this says about the true nature of the American-Israeli relationship, when the Israelis can appear to almost snub their nose to a distinguished diplomat as Dean Rusk, say, for example.
First of all, I would like to, and this goes relates to any other question. You heard me, I'm very critical of Israel, and because the Arab-Israeli conflict is really, the study of the Arab-Israeli conflict is replete with bias and propaganda, I have made a decision to limit myself to what I've studied. So I'm willing to speak on the Johnson administration, or to be more precise, from June 67 to the end of Johnson administration in January 69. Number one. Number two, Mearsheimer, of course, is very critical of Israel in his book about the Israeli lobby, but this is a theoretical book, if you like. As I said, it's a pioneering analysis on this very intriguing subject. Now, in this case, because I read extensively the records, there were, of course, a number of officials in the Johnson administration that were supportive of Israel. Number one, of course, was Arthur Goldberg, the ambassador to the UN. But there are others, quite a number of others, that were quite critical. And first among them was Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State. Normally people say that, because of the Jewish vote, the Jewish influence, because Jews are concentrated in the biggest states in the US, this is the real reason for the impunity or the support they enjoy, especially with the Democratic Party. And Jews tend to vote for the Democratic Party, although it never prevented from Republican presidents from supporting Israel, Reagan, for instance, or not to mention Baby Bush. But in this case, as I said, I studied, my focus is on the Israeli foreign policy. I didn't study in depth the American foreign policy, but it's, I read thousands of documents, and the only explanation I can come with is what I said there. It was his personal attitude. And this is not to say that he was not furious himself, but he didn't take it a step further. For instance, he could have said to the Israel, listen, if you don't start negotiating seriously with Hussein, you don't get the Phantoms. And the request for the Phantoms was made in January 68. His decision to sell the Phantoms to Israel was announced in October. I just returned from Johnson Presidential Library, which is an archive in the US, and I came across a telephone conversation, transcript of, my mouth is dry, of a telephone conversation between Johnson and Goldberg in March 68, and already then he said, look, I made up my mind. I'm going to sell them the Phantoms, but I'm not going to announce it yet. So, this is, I can't think of any other explanation.
I have a follow-up, but I don't want to dominate this proceeding. So can we have some questions?
I'm not going anywhere.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay, questions, please. Yes.
Thank you very much for that talk. It was, as the chair has already said, fascinating. I have many questions, but I'll limit myself to one to start with. In your talk, you did not mention the September 1st Khartoum Declaration by the Arab League of no peace, no recognition, no negotiation with Israel. Do you think it's fair to characterize apparent Jordanian willingness to negotiate in light of their strong public statement to the contrary?
Yes, I do. Actually, look, the book is 170,000 word long. My talk is 5,000 word long. So it's impossible to put everything inside. There are, I think, 4 pages about this. And let me quote, because I want to be accurate. But basically,
what you're saying is they need to buy the book.
Look, it's still a book as well. The Khartoum conference, this is a very good and important question. Israeli diplomacy emphasized, it's supposed to be on chapter 5, emphasized the 3 no's. No recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel. But this was the end of clause 3 of the resolution. And the same clause begins with completely different words, which actually embodied a sea change in the Arab attitude. Give me a second, please. It's I can't find it. It's supposed to be here if you can help me.
What do we have
find
got?
it, but
No peace with Israel,
no,
no
no,
recognition.
before that. It's basically said that the Arabs, you know, I wrote this book, so I should. It's basically said that the Arabs will employ political and diplomatic means in order to gain the lost land. This was a sea change in their attitude, because this was the first time that the Arabs did not talk about military means. They didn't talk about the liquidation of Israel. And the whole world, including President Johnson and other Western countries, recognized the voice of moderation that emerged from Khartoum. Not only them, but even Yaakov Herzog, whom I mentioned earlier, and he was no leftist. He was very much supporter of the settlement project. He also, of course, not publicly, in internal discussions, said that actually this was a moderate approach. Even Eshkol, the prime minister, alluded to this, and Ibn, on the other hand, said that we have to expose. I think I'm quoting his words almost word for word. Expose, because of the whole world or the world press accept or see those resolutions as a sign of moderation, we have to expose them as extreme. I hope this answers your question. It's the beginning of chapter 5, in case you're interested.
Next question, please. Don't be shy. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question that is a bit more recent. How important is it for Israel to keep the Golan Heights today? Do you think it will be possible with negotiation with a future Syrian government?
First of all, as I said, I don't like to discuss the present, but how important? I mean, in my opinion, not important at all, because if you have the opportunity of achieving peace by giving back land, then it's always much better. But some people prefer land to peace. Land to peace.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering how you define this topic, whether you see it as, I think you've been referring to it as a conflict, and I think some people would rather see it as a just clear-cut genocide. And I'm asking what the matter
See what
this topic, the Israeli-Arab, whatever you want to call
genocide.
it.
I would say it's a bit, not more than a bit pushing it.
Right. So that's why I think it's not more than a matter of semantics. Because I think if we're to draw comparisons between W. Eshkol's comments like living space to
Not living. It was Diane who said that.
oh, sorry. Okay.
No,
Well, if comparisons are to be drawn,
people with this funny name, so.
right. Between reminiscent comments by Adolf Hitler, I think that we need to be talking about the same sort of things. Otherwise, it does diminish and belittle what a genocide is. I think when you're comparing between wars, they don't need to be comparable and proportionate. And when you compare between genocides, nor do they need to be comparable. But I think once we're, drawing a comparison between the two, whether it be the Indian-Pakistan conflict and Rwandan genocide or the Nazi Holocaust, whatever genocide it must be, it's inevitably going to diminish what the weight of the term genocide means and it belittles it, I think, unless yeah.
Look, I really don't understand why you use the term genocide, because of course people get killed in wars, but the number of civilian casualties was very small in the 67 war, and even when it comes to the 48 war, I never heard people using the term genocide. There are people who would say
Ethnic cleansing.
ethnic cleansing, which is a completely different thing. When you get rid of people is one thing, when you kill them is another. I'm sorry, genocide is simply an irrelevant term. I mean, these are something else. If we return to what I have described here, there is absolutely no doubt that the Israelis wished, or those, the leaders, of course, wished to see the Palestinians disappear. But they were aware that the world was watching. So they didn't, for instance, things that had been done in 48, like mass expulsions, never took place in 67. This is why the number of the 67 refugees, which is, by the way, the subject of my current research project, is much smaller, or not much smaller, it's about half of the previous one. And many of them left voluntarily.
Okay.
I'm sorry to come back. This is on a different issue, but fairly similar to the one you're just discussing. You argued forcefully that it was the intention of the Israelis to keep the dowry and to keep the land, but as you say, they had this difficulty with the bride that they didn't much like the look of or want to keep. If this really was a clear Israeli intention from the moment the 67 war ended, why were they so clearly unsuccessful? Why was the annexation limited to East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights? Why was the entire West Bank not annexed? When you consider that Israel was by a country mile the dominant military force in the region, was at the height of its feeling of confidence, why is it that they blinked in the if this was really their intention? Why would they not have gone all the way?
In the words of Eshkol, the Prime Minister, we are not, this is the quote, we are not playing chess with ourselves. There was the United States there, and Israel knew full well, the Israeli leaders knew full well that Americans and the rest of the world would not accept it. And as I said when I talked about the annexation, actually there was no annexation. The word annexation was not mentioned in the laws that enabled the annexation, nor the term Jerusalem. It's a bit complicated to explain how it works, those laws, and I'm not a jurist, but Israel, as I said, tried to conceal it, saying, look, this is just municipal fusion. So the short answer to your question, because Israel knew that the world would not accept it. And if you want me to be more accurate as regards, I was talking about the Israeli intentions, but it would be more accurate to say that Israel wanted to preserve the territorial status quo. But always time, a place for you. And the fact is that Israel still controls the West Bank 45 years later, 45 and a half to be more precise.
Okay.
When you ask, when settlers have been interviewed, modern day settlers, and I would assume settlers from kind of previous times, have been interviewed about their kind of reasons for being in the West Bank or in Gaza previously, they usually fall back on a kind of purely religious justification for that in terms of Eretz Israel and the kind of biblical Israel. Do you think that the foreign policy leaders of Israel in this period would seek to justify their kind of territorial desires in terms of those kind of religious justifications, or do you think they would seek to do it in a more kind of political, strategic manner? And if you do, what do you think those would have been?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I understand what you said about the settlers and their motivation, but...
What I was saying, do you think the political leaders at this time in Israel would have sought to justify their actions along with a kind of similar religious narrative?
To justify to the outside world, you mean?
Sure. Or domestically.
Look, the Israeli government, first of all, let me say something about the settlers. You have to bear in mind that the core of the settlers is, of course, there because of ideology, religiously based. But there are many settlers, mostly along the Green Line. The Green Line is the former border on the wrong side of the you know, they can have a nice house for paying for it much less, enjoying clean air instead of living in crowded cities like Tel Aviv. Now, coming to the Israeli leadership, first of all, during the period that I discussed, there were humble beginnings of settlements because of budget constraints and not enough willing settlers, believe it or not. The 73 war caused the emergence of the settlement movement, which is called Gush Emonim, or the Bloc of the Faithful, that generated this huge project of settlements in the West Bank. But the Israeli government, and this is goes back to, or directly to the question, was divided. This was a coalition government, not coalition like here, but you know, in Israel, when you see two Israelis, you have three parties. So the coalition is comprised of, I think at that time, I can't remember now, but probably at least 6 or 7 parties. So there was one party, left-wing party called Mapam, that was for negotiating peace with the Arabs, but they still insisted on keeping the Golan Heights, because member of their kibbutzim coveted the fertile land of the Golan. Others, like Begin, who 10 years later became prime minister, was a cabinet member in '67, and he wanted to keep the entire West Bank, and he said we should not annex it because you cannot annex something that belongs to you. This was his reasoning. So it's very difficult to I mean, it's a long discussion, like going one by one and telling you what was the thinking of each one of them. But I can tell you one thing for sure: they used the pretext of security in order to explain to the world why Israel wanted to keep the territories. We need strategic depth. And in early '68, when Al-Fatah started launching terrorist attacks on targets within the occupied territories and even inside Israel, Deputy Prime Minister Alon, whom I mentioned in my talk, said we need to use this as a pretext to build 25 settlements along the Jordan River, which is, you know, on the extreme, the eastern end of the West Bank. And in this meeting, Eshkol said, I'm not sure that we need to build as many as 25, but yeah, we do need to build the settlement there. So this episode tells you that actually security was just a pretext.
It seems strange that the US would believe that kind of narrative, though.
They didn't believe it.
No, well, okay. Because it seems to me strange that, I mean, in terms of occupying a territory for strategic depth, occupying somewhere like the Sinai is one thing because it's largely desert. But when you occupy...
but it's not yours.
No, indeed. But occupying somewhere like the West Bank, just, I mean, anyone with any kind of experience of occupation or insurgency surely would have some kind of idea of the fact that it's going to generate problems in the long term. I mean, it just seems like a...
There were even Israelis that realized that Israel is going to pay a price for unwilling to negotiate those areas. And as you know, in '73 there was another war, and this was the result of the Israeli intransigence and refusal to negotiate land for peace. And America was aware of it. But all I'm saying is that America never took it a step further, leaning hard on Israel to start negotiating in good faith.
Perhaps I can just jump in there and build on that question. I'm sure you might be aware the great events of 1968 in the United States were somewhat turbulent. You saw Robert Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, Lyndon Johnson. During the time period we were discussing and announced live on television to a shocked nation that he would not seek nor accept his party's nomination for another term as president. And of course America was embroiled in the peace talks in Paris that year. I wondered to what degree perhaps the American inability to coerce Israel was reduced by the domestic turmoil that the Johnson administration, which was almost self-imploding at that point, was going through, and that sense of America was coming apart at the seams. Was there any domestic pressure upon the administration that made them very difficult to coerce Israelis?
I'm not sure about domestic pressure because, as I said, I didn't study particularly the American side of the story. But there is this argument that America was much more involved or more preoccupied with the worsening situation in Vietnam.
Yeah.
But in fact, the Middle East was much more important to them because of the oil. I mean, America didn't have any real interest or interest as important as it had in the Middle East. It didn't have as important in Vietnam as important as in the Middle East. The thing is that they thought, at least in the beginning, to allow Yaring to solve the problem with active, this was the phrase, active support of the Americans. But this is all I can tell you. I'm afraid I don't know more than that.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
The reason I keep coming back is this is very much the subject of my dissertation at the moment, so it's so fantastic to have the opportunity.
What's your topic?
Well, it's basically considering British policy towards the Middle East from the Second Peel Commission onwards to about this period.
Oh, it's
A very big topic and
yeah.
needs to be cut down enormously, but that will be tomorrow's problem. For now, you've spoken a lot about the American desire to get the Israelis to negotiate with King Hussein of Jordan and his willingness, indeed his eagerness, one might say, to negotiate with them. Looking back through the lens of history now towards that, it seems almost ridiculous to think that a deal would have been done with Jordan when we think of the strong sense of developed separate nationalism that exists within Palestinian society now. To what extent do you think you could be being unfair in arguing that Israel should have could have made a deal with King Hussein, which would have completely bypassed the actual will of Palestinians in the West Bank, who certainly were in the process of developing their own autonomous national movement?
Again, this is a very good and important question. The thing is, and the answer is this: between the 48 war and 67, the Palestinian problem was reduced to a humanitarian problem. It was a refugee problem. Because the Palestinians built or trusted the Arab states to solve the problem for them. And in 67, of course, the Arab states failed. And as a result of the disastrous outcome of the war, disastrous from the Arab point of view, actually, in my opinion, it was even more disastrous for the Israelis, because occupation corrupts people. But because of that, the Palestinian problem has turned again, or started to turn again, into a political one. And Palestinian nationalism started to emerge. By no small measure, by the way, thanks to the Israeli actions. For instance, the attack on the Karame al-Fatah base in 68, again, something that is in the book, but I wasn't able to discuss here. But in this period, I mean, the direct answer to the question is this. In this period, first of all, it was just the humble beginning, number one. And number two, and this is much more important, perhaps nothing would have come out of it. And some people might even say, you know, we don't believe that either Hussein or the Palestinians were ready to make peace. But the crucial point is that Israel did believe that they were serious, both of them, both sides. They ignored completely the Palestinians, and the whole world actually thought that Hussein should be the party for negotiations, because he owned, quote unquote, the West Bank. The West Bank was taken from him. And Israel simply did not do that. And this is the crucial point in the sense that I focus on the Israeli peace policy, or the lack of, basically. But you have a valid point, no doubt.
Yes, at the back.
Hey there. You touched on the role of the superpowers.
Could you raise your voice, please?
Sorry, you touched on how the kind of role of the US and the USSR after the war, but I was wondering if you could just elaborate a bit more about their role in the kind of the beginning of the 1967 war.
You mean before the war?
Yes.
Well, before the war, I mean, again, you take me to the background of my study, which is not part of what I have studied. But what happened was, I said I think in the talk I used the term a series of blunders. Basically, it was what happened was that the Soviets fed Nasser with false reports about Israeli troops messing along the Syrian border, and they were false. And Nasser sent his chief of staff to check whether it was true or not, and he came back and he said it was not. And nevertheless, he sent his troops into Sinai. The Soviet ambassador came to see the Israeli prime minister at 2 in the morning. Eshkol received him wearing pyjama in a hotel room in Tel Aviv, and Eshkol told him, look, the ambassador brought a letter from the Soviet premier, threatening with all kinds of threats if Israel does not withdraw its forces from the Syrian border. He said, let's now go to the Syrian border and see for yourself. No troops are there. And the ambassador said, I don't need to go there because I got a letter from my government. They know what they're speaking. So this is basically what I can tell you about this, or what is relevant to the period preceding to the war. But again, I emphasize, I prefer to speak about what I've studied, not of what I learned from other books and studies.
You certainly don't need to apologise. Your question
Just give me another second. The crucial point is, and this goes, of course, to the period after the war, because, again, I mentioned it in the talk, because of the disastrous outcome of the war and the rout of the armies of Syria and Egypt, who were Soviet clients, the Soviets deepened its penetration into the Middle East. And this was, in the context of the Cold War, was an important fact. The Americans were quite worried about this. And as I said earlier, the Americans, both Americans and the Soviets, had a strategic interest in the region, first and foremost because of the oil, the Arab oil. Yeah. Question number 4.
My last one, just picking up on the Alon plan, which I think it's fair to say you criticised as deeply unrealistic and arguably not a serious proposal. While I would certainly concede on the effort that it hadn't been put to the Israeli cabinet undermines how seriously one could take it. I agree with you insofar as the fact that it had not been presented to the Israeli cabinet.
It was presented, but
it hadn't been approved. Sorry,
never been discussed.
Yeah, but the fact that does suggest that its seriousness could be questioned on that count. But on the other hand, is it any surprise that Israel would come into the room or present a negotiating position that might be conceived or perceived as extremely tough? I mean, what else would you expect? You'd hardly expect them to come into the room offering everything back. And a negotiation position, by its very nature, starts at a position you might not expect to win with.
Look, if I want to sell you a car, and I come to you and say, look, I'm willing to sell this car for £1,000. While I have no intention to sell the car, I don't have to sell. If I want to sell the car, I would never sell it for such a price. And actually, I still need the approval of my wife and my 3 kids. Would you consider me a serious person, an honest person? this is exactly the same thing. And you should know about Alon plan, actually it had two versions. The first version was to have an enclave with some kind of autonomy to the Palestinians. He never wanted King Hussein to have any role in this enclave. Only because Israel needed, and again, you know, there's so much that we can say in relatively short presentation, relatively to the book, of course. The new version, which offered a Jordanian enclave with a connecting corridor, was crafted only because they needed something in order to satisfy the American demand to negotiate with Hussein. And I have evidence, recorded evidence, or archival based evidence, that Alon admitted he never changed his initial position, that it should be a Palestinian enclave, an autonomy, in other words, part of Israel, with some kind of self-rule system. So it was a ploy, basically. And the quote that what I quoted from him here says it all.
Probably got time for one more question. If anybody wants to get the last word in, yes.
With regards to what you just mentioned, I was just wondering, Alon's view on the enclave, the Palestinian enclave. When was it formed? Was it post 67, the June 67?
Yeah.
It was the one enabled such a thing to.
He first submitted his proposal to the government in July 67, the first version, and the second version, he made a change in, I don't have the exact date, but around mid-68. And it was presented to Hussein in September 67, but it had been leaked to the press already in July, and this is why the Israelis knew, and because it was in the press, they knew what the Jordanian reaction was to this plan.
Do you have a final question at all?
No, I was just noting down what
You're all done.
No, feel free.
You've got the opportunity to ask. If anyone else got any more questions at all? Right, last one.
Moshe Dayan said that just at the start of the Six-Day War, he said that he didn't feel...
Who said?
Dayan.
Me? Dan.
Sorry. And he said that he didn't want to occupy Gaza because he anticipated the long-term problems that would result from that. Why do you think he changed his mind?
I know I read the same article that it's inaccurate. This is the point.
It's inaccurate.
He didn't say not to occupy Gaza. He wanted to leave Gaza until the Sinai Peninsula or the Egyptian army was crushed. And he didn't want, first of all, he didn't want to deal with the Palestinians. But it's impossible to occupy Sinai if we don't have a map here. But have you seen the map? You would realize it's impossible to take the Sinai Peninsula and leave the Gaza Strip as a Palestinian, or not even Palestinian, it was under Egyptian rule, an independent enclave. You know, once you take the Sinai Peninsula, you must take the Gaza Strip. But he wanted to leave it, the fighting on the Gaza Strip to the end. But it didn't work this way. Actually, they started on the first day of the war. They started the attack on Gaza too. But his main motivation was the Palestinians, or to be more precise, the refugees. More than half of the Gaza Strip population were refugees, 48 refugees.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your questions. I thought they were very interesting. I'm sure if you have any follow-up questions, you can, Dr. Raz can be contacted at the Faculty of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford, and I'm sure we'll be intrigued to receive any email questions that you might have following up on that. A lot more data, of course, can be found in his book, which, as he points out, goes into far more detail. The Bride and the Dowry from Yale University Press. We do have some available at the front here if you'd like to purchase a copy, which will be signed quite merrily.
There's an extra charge for it.
If you'd like to purchase a copy, do come down to the front. If not, all it does is remains me to thank our host, and I appreciate if you could join me in expressing your gratitude in the usual fashion. Thank you very much for coming tonight.